And now, from beyond our dimension, this is the JeffMara podcast. Here's Jeff.
My guest is Dr. Bob Davis, former professor that conducted research in the behavioral and neurosensory sciences. He has published several articles in the Journal of Scientific Exploration and Edge Science, and has given lectures at national and international conferences on consciousness, STEs, and UAPs. Bob has also published highly popular books, including The UFO Phenomenon, Should I Believe?, Life After Death, an analysis at the evidence, and Unseen Forces, the integration of science, reality, and you. His fourth book, The Consciousness Connection, Extraordinary Human Experiences and the Nature of Reality, has been recently turned into a documentary film that is titled The Consciousness Connection. Bob, thanks for joining me and welcome.
No, it's a pleasure to be with you, Jeff. Thank you.
Bob, if you don't mind, can we start with your own personal paranormal and supernatural experiences that led you down this spiritual journey?
I was pretty much a materialist throughout my life, having engaged in science for 3 decades at a university, at State University of New York. But upon retiring about 10 years ago, I started having experiences, 3 in particular. The first one was in Sedona, Arizona, when my wife and I were walking one evening, looking up at the night sky, and I suddenly noticed an orange orb that didn't belong. At first, it catches your attention, and you don't think much of it, but then you start saying it shouldn't belong there. It was just much larger, much unusual looking than your normal events that you see in the night sky. Suddenly, as I'm staring at it for about a minute, and it's motionless, it's about 500 feet up, it's about a half a mile away, a second one suddenly emerges, either from within it or from behind it. It was impossible to tell. And they're both sitting there, stationary, for a couple of minutes. And I'm in awe, and it suddenly winks out. Your mind races. What could that be? Geothermal, plasma energy, people from Mars, the whole bit. But the point is, it did something. It lit a flame in me. I was always a closet ufologist, Jeff. But because of that experience, I had to write a book. I had to learn more about ufology. And so I wrote my first book, The UFO Phenomenon, Should I Believe? And I became a member of the Dr. Edgar Mitchell Research Foundation when we did the free study on over 3,200 individuals who claimed to interact with the UAP and non-human intelligent beings. But then about 2 years later, Jeff, I was awoken one morning with a horrific lucid dream. I felt that I was dying, literally dying. It was that bad. And I felt like I was suffocating. I couldn't breathe. But throughout that experience, I had knowingness that a dear colleague in my laboratory at the college had passed away. I didn't think much of that. I just took it for a bad dream. But it stuck with me. I drove to work that morning, somewhat confused about my experience because I'd never had a lucid dream like that in my life. Nothing close. It was realer than real. So it was a unique morning. Well, as I entered the office, I noticed the looks on my colleagues' faces, and they didn't have to tell me. My dear friend Anne did pass away that morning. At the time, I had that, shall we call it, empathic death experience or shared death experience. And as horrific as that was, I had to learn more about it, about life after death, because I knew there was something there. And I wrote the book, The Life After Death, an Analysis of the Evidence. More of a scholarly kind of text, not necessarily for the general public. He gets into a lot of quantum physics and theories like that get into the afterlife. But my third experience, which really knocked my socks off, was in 2018. I gave a lecture in Australia on UFOs and life after death, and I was invited to attend a party. And the person who was running that party told everybody to sit in a circle and have a healing session. And she starts talking about cleaning engrams, removing attachments, getting rid of negative entities, etc. I started coughing and couldn't stop for 20 minutes straight. And I felt energetic. I felt good. It was so unusual that I said to her, listen, can you come meet me in my hotel room tomorrow and do this with me? She agreed. What she did to me using intention was to facilitate a Kundalini awakening. I literally looked like Reagan in the movie The Exorcist while I felt bliss. My body was writhing in contortions that I couldn't control. My head, if it wasn't attached to my spinal column, would have ripped off. Yet, while I looked so much in distress, I felt nothing but bliss. And I did this to her. I said to her, "Is this all you got? Give me more. Give me more." I felt that good. And that is a Kundalini awakening. I didn't have some of the symptoms, but I had enough of the symptoms to know that that coiled serpent was climbing up my spine, leaving my crown chakra. There was something to it. And that led me to write my third book. Uh, what's the name of it? The Integration of Science, Reality, and You. And I sent that book to a producer who called me and asked me about meeting him for lunch to talk about the book. And I said, okay, let's do it. Extraordinary Human Experiences. And we talked about possibly turning that book into a documentary, which we did. And it is now streamed on Gaia, GAIA.com, which you can view. It's about an hour and 20 minutes long. And it incorporates, I guess, my desire for my Kundalini awakening to make people more spiritual, to make people realize that there's experimental evidence and that we need to use to advocate for a new paradigm that recognizes consciousness as an active participant in life. I just realized that consciousness is not, you can't reduce it to biochemical processes within the brain. I came to that realization during my Kundalini awakening when I felt bliss and I was not in control of my body. I felt a true separation of each. And that alone motivated me to, again, write further and to speak more. And now to have a documentary made, well, that's quite remarkable in a sense, because over the past 2 years, I was also writing another book that paralleled the documentary, Extraordinary Human Experiences, uh, is the name of the book. And it was over 500 pages. I had a lot to say. But, you recognize these significant personal psychological impacts that open the door for the development of other theories and methodologies and frameworks that need to occur because there is something going on. There's no question about it in my mind. And having those three experiences convinced me. I mean, how can they not? So I'm just waiting for my fourth experience, and I don't know. I don't know if I want it, but it probably will happen someday.
I'd like to unpack these experiences a little more. So if we go back to the UFO sighting, did you experience love while seeing those orbs?
No,
Because many
no.
people do.
Many people do. Many people who see no, no. We have to make the distinction here between structured craft and orbs. I find orbs, which can appear in people's bedrooms of varying colors, to be more interesting than these structured crafts. Uh, People do have paranormal experiences in their presence, and they do have emotional reactions to it, and do sense, yes, love, universal consciousness, interconnection, and they do feel a sense of bonding with it. So I've never experienced an orb. Now, what I saw may have been two very large orbs. It may also have been a geothermal plasma, atmospheric event, but I don't know. What do we when we say UAP? It's an overarching issue. What are we talking about? Structured craft, which exist, and orbs, another type of UAP.
Do you feel that an orb is a non-human intelligence and not something physical, like a structured craft?
Yeah, I don't know for sure. I can only go by what people say, and people do claim that it does represent a non-human intelligent entity. That's what people report. Not always. It's often accompanied by paranormal events. So there is certainly something going on. The question is whether or not it is a discarnate entity or not. It's easy to suspect that it might be. It doesn't guarantee that it is, however. But the point is, we're not studying it, and what we should be doing is analyzing just what you're asking. What are people's emotions in response to these orbs, let alone the structured craft and other beings that people reportedly see, from the little grays to the reptilians to you name it. Now here comes orbs, which seem to be much more common these days, so these people are more inclined to discuss it out in the open, given the reduction in negative stigma of ufology in light of the recent disclosure from 2017. So it's really impossible, I think, to say definitively what these orbs are, but we need a thematic analysis from people who experience it to better understand what they may be, what they may represent, and not lump them in necessarily with the structured craft.
Since you're a closet ufologist, were you paying attention to what was going on up in New Jersey? And if so, what is your take on that?
My take is I have no idea. From what I read and people reading different things, we do certainly have some very sophisticated drones, and given the location of a nearby air base, there may very well have been these experimental drones adrift, causing havoc. But it's interesting that you don't hear anything of it now. It like came and went
Right.
all of a sudden. And the Air Force is mum on it, and you don't know what's going on behind the scenes in terms of what these events really represented. Was it a mass sighting? Did we send up drones to intercept other orbs or drone-like, events? I really, really can't speak with any authority on that topic. There's just not enough information to go on to formulate a conclusion.
Well, your book is called The UFO Phenomenon, Should I Believe? And I think that's a perfect question. Should we believe in UFOs?
We have to believe in UFOs. UFOs are real. UFOs are valid. There's no question about it. People have been seeing it for eons. Millions worldwide continue to experience UAPs, and it defies logical explanation. We know that. It raises a great deal of concern and controversy, and it likely presents aviation safety hazards, which our government understandably acknowledged. And that's probably the most they're going to say. But we don't have the scientific and political um, communities that have taken the UAP concern seriously enough, even though Congress is getting involved. They are. They're not going to go anywhere with this. I'm convinced of it. The Congress tried back in the 60s and they were shut down. Regardless of the believers and the experiencers that might exist among the politicians. And I congratulate them for their efforts. But UAP certainly are valid. We did a study in free, and I was convinced from that study, from over 3,200 individuals, the vast majority claimed that they were conscious, awake when they had these interactions, and that probably the most important thing was that 80% of them found it to be a positive experience. And what's also interesting is that a study was just done by my good friend Russ Galpone regarding the Phoenix Lights. That was the largest mass event ever, covering 4 states back in when was that? 97, I think. He studied 115 people who interacted with the Phoenix Lights, and the vast majority found it also to be a very positive experience. Here we see many similarities between the Dr. Edgar Mitchell Research Foundation study that I was involved with and Dr. Scalpone's study involving the Phoenix Lights. It was positive and it was spiritual. And this is the message. These interactions, for some reason, seem to facilitate spiritual messages in people's minds, much like akin to a computer screen. They come away with the knowledge that they are not alone, that there are higher beings, that there are other dimensions. They come away with technological, and spiritual messages, mainly. And that's what we saw in the Free Foundation study. They come away with a strong belief in a deity. There's a study done that 32% beforehand didn't believe in God. After the experience, 70% do. What's that connection? But I take the lead of Alan Hynek, who led Project Blue Book back in the 60s, and Jacques Vallée and John Mack. These individuals have done extensive research in the UAP arena. I have great respect for them. Alan Hynek said to Congress, this phenomenon is a terrestrial, it's the furthest thing from our terrestrial mode of thought. It evokes both physical and mental events. He acknowledged it back in the 60s that there was a spiritual consciousness connection associated with the UAP. And so certainly Vallée wrote about that tremendously in his very popular books. He too acknowledges a possible control system by an extraterrestrial intelligence of some type. And John Mack, who had a fight for tenure at Harvard University, was convinced after interviewing over 300 individuals that they were not psychopathological, and that they did not have any motivating gain by acknowledging that they were actually abducted. I hate that term. They interacted with non-human entities. And he believed too that there was a spiritual rationale behind this, because they too came away with spiritual downloads and messages. And he became a firm believer, like Ballet, like Hynek, in this uh, phenomenon. I'm not going to argue with gentlemen like them, among many others, but those three in particular get my attention.
Well, one of the most famous UFO alien contactees who sees orbs all the time believes that they are angels.
You're talking about Chris Bledsoe?
Yeah.
Yeah. I know Chris, not very well. He does believe they're angels. He may be right. He may be wrong. I'm not gonna interpret what Chris Bledsoe says literally, but he could be right. He tells me he calls them in, and they seem to do their thing. And a lot of people, Chris Bledsoe's not alone.
It's
A
true.
lot of people are interacting with these types of orbs. He's just getting a lot of the CIA attention, um, because of the frequency by which he does it. The question is, I once talked to, I forget his name in the CIA. It doesn't matter. A big source in the CIA, and he was convinced that it was Chris who was responsible for bringing in the orbs. It was him, and not
Wow.
just anybody at random. What is it about Chris that makes him unique? I don't know. But they did a lot of studies with him interacting with this phenomenon, trying to get brain readings from his interactions, but that information has not been made public. So I'm at a loss to explain that, but millions of people are interacting with these orbs. People have HEIS-5, the human initiated contact experiences. CE5s are very common. People trying to call down orbs, structured crafts, beings of whatever type, and it makes for a very nice evening as people come together with wine, song, dance, meditation, and good cheer, trying to bring this phenomenon into reality. I did attend one. I've seen pictures from several, and I'm quite impressed at what at some of the types of phenomena that people are interacting with during their CE5s.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned UFOs and spirituality because one of the topics I wanted to speak to you about is the connection between NDEs and UFO contact. Because out of the hundreds of people I've interviewed, a significant number either have contact with ETs during their NDE or afterwards start having contact.
The percent of people who have NDEs in the United States ranges from about 4 to 8% per year. 200,000 people in the United States alone have an NDE. About 20% of them results from a heart attack. Um, but your question is interesting, because of the people who have UAP experiences, about 20% of them, almost 2 times that of the national average, report to have an NDE, and more so have a OBE, out of body experience. So the question is, what is it about these individuals? Why do much higher percent have NDEs who also interact with UAPs? And we see this complex mix of paranormal uh, events occurring to people who have UAP experiences that are also somewhat similar to the NDE. Now, there are similarities and there are unique differences. The main similarity is that consciousness, of course, is significantly altered in each case in vastly different ways. But Kenneth Ring, a psychologist, once coined the term the paranormal type personality, indicating that there are many people who, for some reason, are a lightning rod to these kinds of events, UAP, NDE, and otherwise. And it may very well be that these individuals who are having NDEs are also this type of personality and attract it for whatever reason. I know people who have pronounced paranormal events almost occurring daily, and I can't figure it out. And these people are not happy about it. They can't explain it. They want it to stop, and it can be very anxiety producing for obvious reasons.
The near-death experiencers in the past were uncomfortable sharing their NDEs. At this point in time, they feel comfortable, but the ones who've also had UAP contact still are not comfortable sharing that aspect.
Well, the NDE is recognized in medicine as a real event. That's not a phenomenon. The question is what's giving rise to it. Is it an actual interaction with an alternate realm of existence, or is it a pure brain event? And that's the nature of the issue. And the UAP, we have no clue. I mean, everybody has a different theory as to what's going on with that. But you know, the near-death experience is a remarkable experience, because there are certain aspects of NDEs called veridical perceptions or verifiable perceptions, where an individual gets confirmation from a third party of an interaction that they had while they have their NDE, proving that their interaction was valid. And during the production of my film, I attended the convention for the International Association for Near-Death Studies in Washington, D.C., and there I interviewed Bruce Grayson, psychiatrist and leading NDE researcher. And he shared with me a story of a veridical perception of an NDE that made him convinced that NDEs are real and that he should focus his attention to NDEs in research. And it goes like this, if my memory serves me right. One of the people that he interviewed was an engineer in South Africa, and he was hospitalized with severe pneumonia, had to be resuscitated, and he had to be in the hospital for an entire weekend to recover. His nurse, Anita, said to him she's going to be taking a long weekend off, and there'd be another nurse substituting for her. While she was gone, he had another respiratory event, had an NDE during that event while Anita was away, and he found himself in a beautiful pastoral scene. And there, to his surprise, was his nurse, Anita. And she comes walking towards him. And he does a double take and says, Anita, what are you doing here? And she said, Jack, you don't need, you need to go back. I want you to go find my parents, tell them I love them very much, and I'm sorry I wrecked the red MGB. The red MGB. Now, this was back in the 70s in South Africa, and there weren't a lot of MGBs there, let alone red ones. So when Jack awoke in the hospital bed, he started to tell the first nurse what he saw about this experience. And she got very teary-eyed, rushed out of the room, because it turned out that this nurse, Anita, did take the weekend off to celebrate her 21st birthday, and her parents had surprised her with the gift of a red MGB. She got so excited, she jumped in the car, took it for a test drive, and crashed into a telephone pole, died instantly a few hours before he had his NDE. Jeff, there is no way that Jack could have known at the time that she had died, or certainly how she had died, and yet he did. And we have now many cases like this that have been corroborated. And when you come across a story like that, as Grayson did, you can't ignore it. You can't ignore it. Like Eben Alexander can't ignore the woman who flew with him on the butterfly wing during his near-death experience. 4 months later, he receives the picture of a woman who was that woman who was with him flying on the butterfly wing during his NDE. She was the sister who died prior to his birth. He never knew her, yet he met her in the NDE. That's a vertical perception. And there are many, many like that, these kinds of stories that can't be explained, certainly by science, and which requires, Jeff, a paradigm shift in science to better understand experiences such as this that can't be explained by Newtonian physics because it wasn't designed to explain it. And the question then is, what does it mean? And we have to go beyond the physical and look at consciousness, look at the non-physical, try to integrate both the physical objective with the non-physical subjective, and make a science of that, a new paradigm shift. And that's what my new book is about. And that's what the film on Gaia.com is also addressing.
Bob, if we go back to your lucid dream where you were suffocating, is there anything else that happened in the dream? I mean, can you break down the dream for us a little more?
It was quick. It was an intense fear. It was I can't breathe. It was I'm dying. And you actually feel death is approaching and you can't breathe. And I found out that Anne, who died, whose information was shared with me purposefully because we were very close. She was very spiritual, and we always talked about these kinds of life after death issues. She was telling me something.
So this came to you like a download?
Yes, it was a knowingness that came upon me.
And I guess she was just reaching out to you to let you know, hey,
Yes.
Bob, this is all real.
I didn't know it for sure at the time, only to find out that later. And I asked her son, what time did she pass away? And it was the same time that I had my shared death experience.
When you were having your Kundalini experience, I'm not sure if the first day you called that the Kundalini experience, but the first day when you were coughing so much, why were you coughing?
Well, that's the question, Jeff. Why was I coughing so much? The only thing I could think of was that I was an ex-smoker. I gave it up about 30 years ago. But I almost felt that when she kept talking about cleaning engrams, removing negative attachments, cleaning out different organs of the body. She was a former physician, so she was very biologic in her detailed descriptions of what you should be thinking about. Clean this organ, this organ, this organ. And I had the sense I was getting rid of the toxins that accumulated in my body from too many years of smoking, which I hope I don't regret as I age. But that was a long time ago. So that's what hit home first. I was getting rid of whatever bad energy, bad toxic material that had accumulated as a result of my smoking. That's the only thing I could think of.
When she uses the word engrams and clearing entities, it kind of reminds me of Scientology. Was she a former Scientologist?
I don't know if she was, but yes, Scientologists use that term engrams. Remove engrams is one of the key features of Scientology in order to make a person so-called clear.
Right. In your latest book, you write about peak experiences. Can you share with us what those are?
Peak experiences are really extraordinary events. They're mystical. They're psychic experiences. We highlighted it in our film. I discussed it certainly in the book. But a peak experience comes in many different forms, shapes, and sizes. The main ones being a near-death experience, out-of-body experience, mediumship, interactions with UAPs and non-human entities, psychedelic experiences, Kundalini awakenings. There are over 200 different types of peak experiences or extraordinary human experiences. And the founder of psychology, William James, identified with these peak experiences, as Walter States did, another noted psychologist. They recognize these awe-inspiring events as something that should be taken seriously because they're very transformative to the person who is experiencing it. You see, this is something that Bruce Grayson told me too. Near-death experiences, for instance, can change a person overnight. What it takes medicine months and years to accomplish. You see? And that too convinced him that NDEs are more than unique. And it represents one of the most significant peak experiences or extraordinary human experiences, of which there are many. But consciousness seems to be the basic foundation to them all. And these peak experiences are generally positive in nature over time, although they can, of course, initially be anxiety provoking. After my Kundalini awakening, I had anxiety for a year. What happened to me? Why? All those questions. It was that dramatic of a peak experience. I had to buy the book, A Spiritual Emergency by Groff and Groff. Make me understand that my experience was called a Kundalini awakening. I never heard the term before. I had to learn about it. You see, my awakening was too dramatic. It was too abrupt. I didn't have the right counseling, the right coaching that people need when they have these types of awakenings, these energetic awakenings. They need assistance. They need guidance. And I had to fly back to the United States 2 days later. It was just too much. I can't explain why it was. It's just too much going on in my head and externally. So it took a year. It dissipated on its own. I kept asking people, what is it, for those who I thought knew, but I wouldn't talk about it to just anybody, that's for sure. A stigma like UAPs, although that's slowly being mitigated. So I was very selective who I shared my experience with. And it was only recently, Jeff, that I started talking about my Kundalini experience recently on podcasts. I didn't mention it. There was a stigma associated with that, thinking that my colleagues at college might, view me wrongly for some reason, which is bull. So Kundalini is real. No one should doubt it. Look it up, read about it from a good source. It's real, it's valid, it exists, and we don't know what it means. And that, you see, that's again why we need a paradigm shift with these peak experiences, extraordinary experiences. We need a paradigm shift to integrate both the physical and non-physical, the subjective essence of what these individuals are experiencing, what they're going through. Why me? What's going on? What are the thought processes involved in this peak experience that I'm having? Which again is an overarching term for many individual types of experiences that fall under its heading. The question is, though, in the long term, it's generally received as positive. noted behavioral transformations occurred in near-death and out-of-body experiences. There's no question about it. But we see it with all types of awe-inspiring events that kind of have a consciousness connection to it, where there's increased compassion and love, and people feel a decrease in being materialistic. They're more focused on altruism, helping humanity, pursue professions in healing and service to other people. They try to have a renewed sense of a purpose and a drive in life. So the priorities or understandings of important aspects of life are very much changed in all matters that are deemed important and relevant, especially between spouses. And interestingly, there was a study done that showed after 10 years, 70% of a person who had an NDE wound up having a divorce. Now, the average is something around 50%. 70% is statistically significantly higher than the average, implying that the person changes so much that the other person who didn't have the NDE views that person as being so different. You know, why is this person acting, behaving the way they are? The point is that these kinds of events are to them mind-blowing. They're ineffable. They're extraordinary. They're benevolent in in most respects, but they create this kind of consciousness connection. The name of our film and Gaia.com, the name of my book, The Consciousness Connection. There's something there with the essence of the individual, and we don't have the definition for consciousness. There's actually 20, 29, 30 different types of definitions that have been used recently in articles written about consciousness. There's no uniform opinion about what we're talking about, but we're talking about something that's much more different than the brain. And that's probably the most we can say at this point. We're talking about the brain as one entity and consciousness. You know, the that too is dependent on the brain, while consciousness and the brain coexist during life. But once the body is no longer functioning, when it's deceased, consciousness is believed to continue. But getting back to the main point, these kinds of experiences are remarkable because they make people more spiritual, more philosophical. The majority are profoundly changed, even after having one out of body experience, let alone a near death experience. But their belief in God, I think I mentioned it earlier, increases dramatically after these kinds of events, uh, given the spiritual aspect of it, the consciousness aspect of it. But it does lead to that ego dissolution. You know, there's a shift that reduces the self-centeredness in a sense. They become uh, um, uh, more interconnected rather than feeling like I'm a distinct entity and the world revolves around me, where many egoic people, tend to feel, especially the narcissists in our world. But uh, they now want to give more to people, humanity, and want to bring society to a more uh, compatible uh, means of existence for all who experience it. They're all so terrified too, more so by the negative stuff that happens in our world. While you tend to be more sensitive to the positive, you're also become more sensitive to the negative as well. And it's hard to shut that off because it is so real and in our life. and it makes you question your own state of being, in a sense, to realize that there is so much horror, war, suffering, famine. We understand it all. The question is, why should life be like this now? We think we're so modern in our Western society, when in fact we are technologically, but spiritually we pale in comparison to those in more Eastern countries who regard spirituality and consciousness very differently than we do, who, because we tend to be much more materialistic, more objective. You know, we're called monists, materialists, as opposed to dualists or panpsychics, or or in other terms that they had to describe people who study consciousness. Um, but you know, we may be advanced in some ways, but not in other ways. We should be trying to facilitate, I think, what we regard as the essence of the human being, their strengths, their understandings, their extrasensory perception, which is valid, by the way. And don't get me started in that discussion. ESP is indeed real. It's just not facilitated early on in life. But we should have curriculum in college on parapsychology, on what's considered extraordinary events. Uh, we should focus on near-death experiences and other types of these kinds of experiences in courses in college, in high school, and lower grades, to make people more aware of life, of themselves, of what the essence of consciousness means and implies. We're more than just the physical body. We have much more control over the physical body than we believe, but we're not taught that early on in life. We succumb to the physical nature of the body too often, and are hostage to it, in a sense, just like we are hostage to our brain. Yet we should try to exercise much more control over our thoughts and our feelings and the way we conduct life. But we live with the brain, and that's the enigma. We live with this 3.5 pound mass of fat and protein between your ears, and you know, we're humbled by its amazing capabilities, its quantum processes, and it is a quantum processor. But we're also at the same time uh, held hostage to its fallibilities. You know, it reminds me of Jill Bolt Taylor. She had a stroke of the left hemisphere. Her left hemisphere was shut down, the logical side, the reasoning, formalizations, decision making, and her right hemisphere was just operating during her stroke. And she was a neuroanatomist, so she was acutely aware of what was going on. And she felt one with the universe, at one with the universe. She felt like she was moving from a solid to a fluid, as she put it. And she felt like everybody should experience just what the right hemisphere of the brain could provide you. You know, it's the left, the analytic side, as opposed to the more empathic, emotional right hemisphere that controls much of us, as well as right brain. And we call people left and right brained, and I marvel at those that have both a very strong left and right brain, who excel both in the sciences and the arts. It's like Albert Einstein. He said, uh, all religions, music, and art come from the same branch of the tree. And he said he developed his theory of relativity while he was playing the guitar, excuse the guitar, the violin. the violin. He felt music, the essence of music was critical to his thought processes, and he said it helped facilitate his theory of relativity, which came about during while he was playing a violin.
Bob, do you pay attention to coincidences like repeating numbers and stuff like that?
I do. I do at times. I've had synchronicities. It's just a sign that reality is far more complex than we can imagine. Uh, and Carl Jung initially described it as a synchronicity early on, but they certainly exist. Repeating numbers, the brain is a pattern recognition too. We gotta keep that in mind as well. It looks for similarities in our universe, so it might see the same number much more frequently, and you think it's occurring more frequently when it may not be. But it's hard to say. I've had synchronicity once. My wife was sailing into the port of Costa Rica, and she happened to send me a video while the ship was entering the harbor of Costa Rica. 2 minutes later, I see a license plate. It says Costa Rica. I don't know if I've ever seen one before. And it says MAE, May. And May is the name of our granddaughter, who at the time was something like 2 months old. So it had timing and meaning, and that's the key to these synchronicities: timing and meaning. At least it had both to us.
How do you go from thinking, is this, real, or is it just some kind of confirmational bias? Do you just have to take a leap of faith?
That the paranormal is real.
Well, like these synchronicities, like you saw.
You have to be careful because there are things like meaningful coincidences, and that can be interpreted as synchronicities. Um, but you have to look for both the timing as well as the meaning of the event for it to be a true synchronicity. It's like here's the true story. A writer wanted to um, email a professor uh, for a reference as part of his dissertation paper, and he was reluctant to do it for some reason, and he didn't. Shortly thereafter, he took a long journey to some place in Indonesia, an island, quite remote. As he's coming down the stairs and approaches the desk, he sees the name of the professor in the book of guests. And he suddenly looks up and sees the professor that he was going to email to, walking down the steps. What's the odds of him coming in contact with the person that he was going to communicate with, in that manner? Is that a meaningful coincidence, or is there both timing and meaning? I'm sure he had long discussions with him and was a valuable asset in terms of his dissertation.
A topic that's really popular on YouTube right now is the simulation theory. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Tom Campbell, physicist, strongly believes that. Diane Hennessy Powell, theory of my big toe, simulation hypothesis, the virtual reality. There could be some truth to it. Mathematically provable doesn't mean it's real. It reminds me of when Diane Hennessy Powell, a neuropsychiatrist, was talking to an autistic savant. And this autistic savant is capable, at the age of 4, of converting long numbers into cube root numbers. Another child, age 6, speaking 5 different languages without prior exposure to language. But getting back to the mathematician, she asked him, how can you possibly come up with the accurate answer to this mathematical problem? And he says, it just pops in my head. That's what they say. Just comes to me.
Like a savant.
Yeah, an autistic savant, the Rain Man. I forget his name in real life.
Mhm.
Um,
That brings up something that I wanted to ask you, and that is many near death experiencers appear to have some sort of psychic ability afterwards. And I
it,
feel like it's kind of like a version of acquired savant syndrome, but not with mathematics and music.
that's interesting you say that. Many claim to have enhanced psychic ability
Mm-hmm.
as well as healing ability. That hasn't been proven. I keep hearing that quite frequently as a symptom, but again, here again, we need to study this. Where are the scientists that are actually looking at this? There are more questions than answers. I mean, we've had meta-analyses of ESP studies that have shown ESP to be valid, and the American Psychological Association even said just that. There's no evidence of fraud or any abnormal experimental model that could account that meaning that these results are valid. ESP is real. It's just a very small effect size. You get a significant statistical effect from a group. It doesn't mean I could read your mind, although mediums who have clairaudience can hear distinctly different voices than their own, as if there's a so-called drop-in. Another being is taking over their body. And interestingly, the posterior part of the frontal lobe, it shows a decrease in activity in mediums who are doing their mediumship skills, meaning there's a decrease in functional control because a drop-in is taking over their body and they lose control. And this is shown neurologically, which again, we should be doing more studies on.
Well, you have the 4 books and the movie. Is there anything else that you're working on that you want people to know about?
No, actually, I'm taking a rest. I just
Mm-hmm.
had back surgery about 3 months ago,
Mm,
and I'm doing much better, thank
mm.
you. And but the last 2 years I've been writing. It got my mind off the pain, and that was very cathartic. And at the same time, I was working on the movie with Dave Beatty and Wilson Hawthorne, my co-producers. They were Dreamtime Entertainment, and it's that film, The Conscious Connection Foundation, is just now streaming on Gaia.com. And my book, The Consciousness Connections, of the same name, Extraordinary Human Experiences and the Nature of Reality, is just came out. So they were both released simultaneously, and I'm burned out. I'll be very honest. I need to rest. I'm actually bored looking for things to do because I'm so used to working. Um, but I'm also used to lying in bed a lot because of the bad back.
Well, before we wrap it up, can you leave us with a last positive message?
I congratulate all of you for being here. Just your presence alone brings such attention to the fact that you're spiritual and that you regard consciousness as well highly, and that you are evolving as a human being. And stay on this quest. Stay on it. go down that rabbit hole. There's a lot to be learned. There's a lot of nonsense out there as well, so be careful. But shows like JeffMara's is excellent, and they're few and far between, in fact. But stay with it. Listen to your gut feeling. Your gut feeling is your unconscious. Listen to it, and come to the realization that Kundalini awakenings are real. ESP is real. UAPs are real. NDEs are real. And there is no doubt. And every day people question it, but they shouldn't. And I congratulate all of you for being here with us today. Thank you.
Bob, thank you for your message, and thank you for being my guest.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for watching the JeffMara podcast. I really appreciate you. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. And if you do, there are loyalty badges and other perks depending on your level of membership. All you need to do is click the join button underneath the video to find out more. Thank you for your support.